Howdy boneheads, and happy Halloween. I know that the sound quality of this part of the video is not going to be good because I'm just doing it off of my phone, but don't worry, it's not going to be that the whole time. If you read the title for this video, then you obviously know what you're about to watch. This is the Little Nightmares supercut. I spent a lot of time and a lot of research putting together 3 pretty big video essays for the series of Little Nightmares in celebration of the fact that Little Nightmares 3 is going to be coming out next year, and also just because it's a series that I love myself. And people had a really great response to them. You all seemed to really like them. And so I thought, kind of as a fun Halloween treat, what I would do is put all of those essays, just jam them right together, take out the ads, take out the stuff that's referencing the older videos, and just make it one big, concise video covering all of the themes, all of the plot, all the story. It'll be especially good for those of you who I know like putting on video essays in the background. This will be probably over 2 hours. I don't know exactly how the math works out, but it'll be around there, so plenty to watch. It'll make your Halloween very fun. If you haven't seen any of the videos, you can watch the entire thing the full way through and get the full idea of what I was talking about and what's so great about the games. Thank you so much for all your support. We are getting really close to 50,000 subscribers. I have a Connor Unscripted on the way. I know I've been saying that for a long time, I promise. But happy Halloween, enjoy the video, and thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate all of you. Also, get the merch. Get the merch. Questionable by EvanArts04 on Instagram. All right, enjoy the video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Bye-bye.
There is a creature that sits dormant in each of our bellies, a being whose very existence represents a deeper desire for consumption than the simple pangs our body sends when we haven't eaten in a long time. No, this is something else. This ugly little monster is different, darker. Something that only appears, or maybe that we only notice once we're old enough, big enough to see over the wall of our own enclosure of childishness, past the barriers of innocence we've been clinging to, and once we do see it, that hidden demon in our bellies, there's no going back. Do you remember when you were little, the first time you looked at an adult, maybe a parent or a teacher, and noticed that there was something wrong with them? And I don't mean in a dramatic horror movie reveal kind of way. I mean, when was the first time you talked to a drunk person? The first time you saw an adult cry or hit another person? As children, we're taught to believe that being an adult means having things figured out, not reverting to the emotional outbursts and responses that define childhood behavior. So when we see it, even as a kid ourselves, it feels incorrect, out of order, almost dreamlike. There's a power dynamic that exists between children and adults, an unspoken agreement that makes things work, kind of, usually. The agreement is, as the adult, you have more power, but also a greater responsibility to control it, and as a kid, you have less power, but a lower expectation for self-control, which means that the burden of maturity and benevolence is always on the adult, the one who holds the power. Some adults fail to recognize this burden, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. This dynamic, while typically considered to be the bare minimum of caregiving, is essential to providing a child with a stable enough environment that they can grow up well-adjusted and with a healthy understanding of complicated things like love, power, respect, and discipline. In any situation that involves children and adults, the children are always the dependent variable. Very infrequently does any change in child behavior significantly impact that of their caretakers, but a change in caretaker behavior absolutely affects the child. That's why when this essential dynamic is interrupted or changed, the results are always much more visible through the child and not the adult. Adults are scary because most people are one, statistically, and as a kid, you recognize that not only do these people have authority over you, but most of them also have real strength, size, and agility on you. When these are good people, people you trust, people who would use their power to defend you, this is a good thing. Let them do the heavy lifting, let them do the hard thing. When these are not good people, adults are really scary, because even the good ones still have that thing in their stomachs, that squirming bastard just itching to be let out. I think a lot of kids can see the monster from their angle. I think a lot of kids know how little it takes for that monster to get out. Adults are really fucking scary because some of them are not good. Some of them are very, very bad. The adults in Little Nightmares are very, very, very bad. In August of last year, Supermassive Games and Bandai Namco announced the release of Little Nightmares 3, and while that release has been pushed back to 2025, I thought it might be a good idea to look back at the games and the other pieces of fiction that have been released before this third installment into the game series is available. For people who've played the games, this video will act as sort of a recap with some theories, supplementary information, and larger ideas sprinkled in. And for those who haven't played but want to know what they're in for, this video is a great place to start. There will be spoilers in this video, and there won't be another warning about it, so if you're interested at all in playing after hearing my introduction or seeing the B-roll, I'd really recommend doing that first, then coming back. The games are pretty reasonably priced and can be completed comfortably over the course of a few hours. This video will still be here when you're done. The universe of Little Nightmares is one of the most interesting horror settings I've ever encountered, and it might surprise you to learn just how many pieces of official Little Nightmares content exists out there. There are 2 main games, each with their own DLC, a series of digital comics, a mobile game, and even a 6-episode podcast series. I'll be talking about all of these, but obviously, most of my focus will be on the 2 main games. However, before I do that, I want to prep you with some recurring things you'll probably notice from this universe. Almost every story, from the games to the podcast to the comics, touches on one or more of the following ideas. The idea of hedonism, or manic, almost mindless consumption. Food shoveled into mouths without being tasted, morbid obesity while others nearby starve, actively choosing the less healthy or more disturbing option when it comes to sustaining yourself. The universe of Little Nightmares has a lot to do with greed and selfishness, and in many cases, this focus is presented in the most grotesque and exaggerated light possible. The idea of constantly being watched. There is eye imagery everywhere in Little Nightmares. Covered mirrors, buildings that sometimes lean forward to get a better angle on you, and near the end of Little Nightmares 2, we get a peek behind the cosmic curtain of this universe and realize that even the strangest and most deeply entrenched parts of this conspiracy seem content, at least for now, just to keep watching you. It's very Magnus Archives coded. The idea of social hierarchy. In Little Nightmares 2, during a section where you're exploring a school, you encounter a bunch of monstrous children. Those children are annoying threats until the teacher is nearby, at which point they all become well-behaved, and the teacher becomes the new threat. And though it's never overtly stated, a lot of the story events would imply that the teacher likely acts and reacts at the behest of the signal tower. What I mean to lay out is that every antagonist in these games are independently threatening, but none of them are alone, and none of them really seem that smart or capable. Most of the actions and violence being enacted by our antagonist seems to be part of a larger whole, a means to an end, or a product of some larger motivation held by a third party. Our antagonists are working for others, with some exception. The idea of hidden identity. In these games, you're going to notice a lot of people wearing masks, including your own character in the second game. The iconic yellow hooded raincoat from the first game also does a great job of hiding your character's full face, same with the lighting and the framing. For what reason does identity, or rather the hiding of it, take such great precedence in these stories? Well, we'll talk about it a bit more later, but part of that answer is probably the next recurring idea. The idea of betrayal and vengeance. In pretty much every story being told in this universe, there's at least one betrayal and one moment of violent retribution. You have to deal with a lot playing through both of the Little Nightmares games, and during that playthrough, some really unfortunate things are done to you. You're attacked, imprisoned, chased. At any given time, there's usually at least one entity actively trying to murder you. That gets exhausting. Eventually, you have to do something about it. It's only fair. A lot of the enemies in these games get their just desserts when their time as the antagonist comes to a close. These scenes are usually the most satisfying you'll encounter while playing. What's less satisfying is the strange, almost out-of-character cruelties you enact against others sometimes in these games. It happens infrequently, but when it does, it raises a concern you hadn't even thought to consider. What if you're not any better than the things trying to hurt you? What if you're worse? All these themes are pretty crucial and easy to recognize while enjoying the universe of Little Nightmares, but there's no theme more relevant and worthy of mention than the final one. The idea of adults being bad. Little Nightmares does a really good job of creating horrifying and completely unique creatures that clearly also represent real-world identities or situations. Speaking broadly, your main antagonists of the first game are a janitor, 2 chefs, and a woman. Now, if you know what those characters look like and what they're capable of, you know that those titles are incredibly reductive, but the point still stands. There are familiar elements to our enemies. Which is really the point that I'm making when I say that adults are bad. It's not just that the creatures themselves are physically bigger than you and therefore are adults. Time and attention has been put into making the processes that these figures represent, processes that we'd be incredibly used to encountering in real life, especially as a child, defined an essential part of these villains' characterization. They aren't just big monsters. They are people with careers and identities that are monstrous. There are deeper levels to this claim as well. In the podcast series The Sound of Nightmares, arguably the most grounded addition into the series, a great deal of our time is spent listening to interactions between the counselor and his patient, which we'll get into later. The counselor is presented, at least initially, as a benevolent force who's simply trying to help, but you know that whole recurring betrayal bit? It shows up here. Interestingly, most entities are officially named kind of exactly what they represent. The character who resembles a janitor is called the janitor. The characters who look like twins and act as chefs are called the twin chefs. And interestingly, the character whose job is being a counselor is simply called the counselor, a naming convention implying that the counselor himself is also a monster. But he's not. Not literally, at least. He's just an adult. So, alright, now that we've covered things to be looking out for, I want to introduce you to 6. It's the number that comes before 7. 6 is the name given to the protagonist you play as in the first Little Nightmares game, and I'm pretty confident that she's one of the most important characters in the Little Nightmares universe. These and unexplained events of the games are tied to or the direct action of 6. We don't know a lot about 6. Has a raincoat is perhaps one of the character's defining traits, so that should tell you something about what kind of character she is. She's a silent protagonist. We don't need to hear what 6 thinks about what's happening to her because we're controlling her and should be thinking similar enough things ourselves, as long as we're properly invested. But there's a deeper mystery to 6, one that you become aware of from the first instant you meet her in the first game, and one that becomes impossible to ignore by the end of the second game. 6 has something about her that makes her different, not just from the terrifying adult monsters, but from the other children around her. The game's official description of 6 as a character includes the line, "Most children would have already given up, but 6 is different. She's smart and tough and has a lovely yellow raincoat. She belongs elsewhere." And Little Nightmares 2 has this to say about the character. Awaking in a world she cannot recognize, 6 must learn to trust someone else if she's to stand a chance of survival. She's already seen more than any normal child ever should, but then, 6 is not a normal child. So yeah. From the get-go, even in the game's own flavor text, the idea that 6 is a distinctly unique entity, even among other kids, is heavily implied. So, before we can talk about 6 and her place in all of these stories, we first have to establish a clear timeline. All of the content that exists for Little Nightmares, except maybe the comics, are all canon to the official story of the world, a place called the Nowhere. We know that the place is called this for 2 reasons. The first is that the name was revealed for the Little Nightmares 3 release trailer, the description reading, "Are you ready to return to the Nowhere, little ones? This time, face your childhood fears together." The second is the podcast. We're going to talk about that at the end, because it adds a lot to the conversation, but would be kind of confusing to reference without a more firm understanding of the rest of the series. So, let me take you through what I believe to be the official sequence of events, how you should consume the series if you want to do it completely in order. The very first title in the timeline is a mobile game called Very Little Nightmares, and afterwards comes the digital comics, then Little Nightmares 2, until we officially end with the very first actual release from the series, just Little Nightmares. It's been interesting consuming the series as it comes out because it almost feels like you're working backwards. But I'm not going to do that to you. Over the next couple minutes, I'm going to take you through a very basic summary of the overarching plot of Little Nightmares, and then we'll come back and talk about some of the interesting things we glossed over, and when that's finally taken care of, we can discuss the podcast and its implications. So here goes. Very Little Nightmares is not a story about 6, though you'd be forgiven for believing that. Though she does appear later into the game's plot, the raincoated figure you're piloting is not 6. Her name is the girl in the yellow raincoat. See what I mean about Little Nightmares naming conventions? And she's trapped in a strange place called the Nest. You might be asking, Connor, how did she get into the nest? And the answer is balloon. Beyond that, though, it's unclear, though I think the podcast might answer that question. We'll get to it. Over the course of your playthrough, you navigate through the rooms and landscape of the nest, encountering strange monsters like the Craftsman, a wheelchair-bound and long-limbed man who tries to kill you, the Butler, a telekinetic cleaner who tries to kill you, and the Pretender, a doll-obsessed girl who tries, and succeeds, to kill you. During your time trying to escape, you encounter a young girl in white several times, one who manages to keep a safe distance but does help you out when you need it. Near the end of the game, while you're running from your life, pursued by this ravenous Pretender enemy, the girl in white hits your pursuer with a boulder just before you run out of room on a high cliff to run away. There's a moment before the Pretender wakes up again, and the two of you plummet to your deaths off the cliff into the murky water below. All that remains is your raincoat, the very same raincoat that'll be picked up by the girl in white when she encounters it on a rainy street corner in Little Nightmares 2, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. If you haven't realized by now, the girl in white was Six, and though the story isn't about her specifically, the real point of Very Little Nightmares is showing you where Six was before Little Nightmares 2 started, and how she got to the Pale City. The digital comics help add to this. All of the digital comics can be accessed through the free application LN Comics, and the app includes 6 comics which help expand and add to the universe we've been exploring. The comics are very short, and some give more information than others, so I'm just going to give a couple short sentence-long summaries of each of them, except for number 1 and number 6, which we'll actually talk a bit more about last. Comic 2. We follow a very young-looking child in a blindfold and diaper as he attempts to survive in some kind of wilderness setting. He encounters an outhouse with a TV in it that a figure appears in, and with no warning, the child is gone, seemingly as a direct result of whoever was in the TV. Comic 3. A girl is trapped in what appears to be an abandoned hospital or something of the like. She's digging at the ground with her nails, trying to escape. Eventually, someone slides a spoon under the door towards her, and she's able to tunnel out of the room she's trapped in. She wanders the dimly lit halls of the building, unaware that a monstrous figure is following her from the ceiling. Comic 4. A tricycle and a small, childlike figure are thrown off the roof of a building. A young boy in tears is pursued by a number of hideous porcelain children who are shown to be incredibly violent and cruel towards each other. As he runs, he uses a lollipop as a makeshift club, smashing apart the heads of the deranged children until he runs out of places and is forced to hide in a locker. A horrifying, long-necked woman finds him in his hiding place and opens the door, sealing his fate. Comic 5. We see the following events from the perspective of a child in a ghost costume. 2 figures watching TV, a pile of dirty dishes, a dead rat in a cage, and an open window to freedom. Our ghostly protagonist climbs throughout the house, paying special attention to the 2 figures, and makes his way to the window. By the time he gets there, he's lost track of the figures, and they surprise him before he can escape, their faces twisted into hideous, unreadable shapes. So, those are the 4 comics that add some more information to this universe, but they don't really tell us more about the overall plot. Most of the horrific villains we see in these comics are simply the enemies from Little Nightmares 2, given a little bit more time to shine and be generally horrifying. But there's nothing critical, at least not on the surface. But before I get to that, let me first describe what happens in the 6th comic. A child wearing a paper bag on his head is one of a number of panicking children, all of which are terrified due to the fact that they've been trapped in a burning building together. It's chaos until the sprinkler system suddenly turns on and a new problem rears its head. Something is taking the kids now. A long-limbed being begins snatching up children left and right, and our child in the paper bag makes a break for it, reaching another room with a smashed TV and hiding within that television as the entity reaches the room. It's really interesting that the last thing we see of this character is him inside of a television, and you'll understand why in just a little bit here. The comic leaves what happens next up to your imagination, but there's a great deal of evidence to suggest that this bag-headed figure makes it out, leading us to one of the most important comics. Number 1. What we see in this comic is a girl in white running through the wilderness, clearly afraid and pursued by something or someone. This is the girl from Very Little Nightmares. This is Six. After escaping the nest, she found her way here somehow and is trying desperately to stay alive. As she runs through this dark forest, she sees a figure sitting in a tree lit in moonlight. It's the kid with the bag on his head. He did make it. The 2 characters, Six and this kid, look at each other for a moment before suddenly that entity, the one with the shotgun that had been pursuing Six, appears and takes Six God knows where. You may have noticed the interesting factor of there being a character named Six who appears in one of 6 comics that cover a total of 6 individual kids. A theory has been posited that Six's name is a reference to this very structure. She's the 6th of a set of children to be kidnapped or brought to whatever this place is. There's another theory about her name that has a lot to do with some environmental evidence from Little Nightmares 1, but more information has come out since that theory gained popularity, so it seems unlikely. We'll talk about it when we get to Little Nightmares 1, but first, we have to get through Little Nightmares 2, which is pretty easy after reading comic number 1. The content of the comic actually lays out the events that transpired literally just before Little Nightmares 2 begins. So, in Little Nightmares 2, you play as this bag-headed character, a figure known as Mono, a name that as a prefix means the only one, the singular, or potentially the independent. In the face of Little Nightmare 2's narrative, this is a super interesting naming choice. Interestingly, the first time we meet him, just as he's waking up from a nightmare, a staple of the Little Nightmares introductory scenes, there's a television turned on behind him, one that shuts off just a few moments after he gets his bearing. The nightmare he had been having was something about a long hallway with a door at the end. Keep that in mind, it'll appear more in the future. You wake up in the wilderness, a wooded area that is probably the very same from that first digital comic. If we're going by that information, then it's likely that Mono already knows where the figure with the shotgun, who the game calls the Hunter, is, and where he's taken Six. You're able to find the two of them easily, with Six in a cage listening to the sounds of a music box, a song that will likely be familiar to anyone who's played through the series in order of release. This is a song of comfort to Six, one of the only things that really appears to bring the character peace throughout any of her appearances in universe. The two characters break out of the house together and begin being pursued by the Hunter, who fires his shotgun wildly at them, managing to barely miss or hit other objects as he mindlessly follows you. This is one of the first truly intense moments we've seen from the series. The app has its moments, but it's a bit too cartoony to be taken fully seriously, and while reading the comics we understand the stakes, we're not fully immersed in the universe, not in the same way as we are for a scene like this, where each blast of his shotgun rings through our ears in the forest, where you can hear the Hunter's grunts and almost feel the warmth of his lantern light passing over you as you hide in the tall grass. This is the atmosphere that Little Nightmares is best at cultivating, and now seems to be an appropriate time to talk about why they're so good at it. The creative team behind the Little Nightmares series is clearly very intelligent, creative, and inspired, but one quality I feel they understand better than anything else is how to use scale to effectively set the scene and the stakes. Hell, even the name of the game lends credit to this focus. Clearly, one of the guiding principles to the first game's conception was the idea that every item, room, and entity should serve the grand purpose of dwarfing you as a character and making you feel even smaller than you actually are. That's why the difference in size between adults and children are so exaggerated. In reality, adults are often bigger than children, but usually to a degree of only 2 times or so. This makes sense because in reality, adults started out as children. However, in Little Nightmares, I have a much harder time believing this. Adults are almost like another species, many times larger than any child they encounter, capable of doing things that none of the children ever seem capable of. All evidence except for one crucial reveal near the end of the game points to the large adult entities being fully independent from the more regular appearing human entities. That reveal, though, throws everything into question and even backs up the possible fan theory from the first game. We'll talk about that later, though. What I like about the Hunter is that he's faceless. Not really, I mean he wears a mask. As far as monster design goes, the Hunter isn't all that frightening. Not without his gun, at least. The thing about a person with a gun is that it doesn't matter what they look like. They're scary by the virtue of their capacity for violence. In a series that pays great attention to what scares children, what literally gives them nightmares, the idea of a faceless killer with a gun is terrifying because children are forced to think about unknown shooters regularly, whether at home, in dangerous areas, or at schools in general. Now, let me be clear. I think to imply that this character is meant to represent something as horrible as a school shooter is incorrect. For one thing, the environment doesn't quite match up, especially acknowledging the fact that you actually do visit a school later in the game. But further, this game isn't going out of its way to tell that kind of a story. Simply, the encounters you have with the Hunter give a more primal look at one aspect of what children fear: senseless violence. There are many instances of it throughout the series, but never is it so evocatively portrayed. Never does it feel so real. There's a moment, as you're navigating this wilderness area, that you encounter a collapsed bridge, one that Mono has to hold in place while Six jumps to the other edge. After Six makes it across, the only way for Mono to join her is to take a running leap off the edge and to be caught by Six on the other side. He does this, and Six manages to pull him up. It's one of the first full moments of teamwork you have together, and it's a moment absolutely worth remembering, even, and especially, up to the end of your playthrough. Eventually, the Hunter corners Six and Mono in a shed where they manage to find another shotgun. As the Hunter tries desperately to get into the shack, the duo of children line the gun up to face the door and, in an explosion of gunpowder and wood, fire the gun into the Hunter. We don't see what happens to him, but he stops pursuing us after this point, so I have a pretty good idea. This is not the first time Six has used violence or witnessed death that she took part in, but it is one of the most hands-on times she's ever been involved. It's worth paying attention to the instances where Six is violent, because in both games, you can notice a bit of a shift in her behavior depending on the circumstances she's encountered up until that point. Six is a character that the more you pay attention to, the less certain of her stability you are. But of course, again, we're getting ahead of ourselves. At this point in the experience, a first-time player might not even be certain that the character they're interacting with is Six. She is missing her iconic raincoat after all. The two children board a piece of drifting wood as a raft and sail out to sea, in a scene that really feels like the beginning of the game. I wonder during this introductory scene if maybe there's also more to the ocean itself in the series, the way it always seems to bring those who cross it exactly where they need to be, or at least where something needs them to be. There's not a lot of concrete evidence in one direction or another, but perhaps that's a testament to the cosmic nature of the sea in general. See my call of the sea essay for more of that. The place the children arrive is a place known only as the Pale City. And oh boy, this city is... rough. Playing the games in order of release, this reveal of a whole city to be explored is wild, as it's such a massive scaling up of the first game's environment. Little Nightmares 2 is simply a bigger game than its predecessor, likely because of that predecessor's success, and this first look, walking onto that foggy shore, seeing the towering buildings, it's like growing up in a haunted house, then moving out into the real world and realizing that there are actually just ghosts everywhere, and that the horror wasn't contained just to that smaller example you started out in. What a great moment. You'll become aware very quickly of a tower in the distance of this city that seems to hold some greater influence over the world, or at least this city, though it seems perpetually out of reach, at least now. One thing you may start to notice more frequently are TVs, and specifically the people watching them. The tower in the distance certainly resembles some kind of point of transmission. It has to be tied to the TV somehow. Speaking of the TVs, eventually you'll encounter one that seems different than the others, almost like it's calling to you. When Mono puts his hand against the TV, he is able to manipulate the image within in a strange way, and he does so a few times until the TV sucks him into a scene that resembles the dream he had at the beginning of the game. He's running in slow motion down a long, twisting hallway towards a door, and yet, every time he seems just about to reach it, he's pulled out of the TV. This sequence of events will occur a number more times throughout your playthrough, each time Mono getting closer and closer to the door before being ripped out of the scene. We as the player don't know why Mono is so desperate to get to that door, or what's behind it, but I'd also be willing to bet that Mono himself doesn't know. It's just one of those things that happen in dreams. You find yourself running towards something like it's the most important thing in the world, even if, in the moment, you can't exactly explain why that's the case. When Mono is pulled out of the TV for the first time, Six seems anxious about the development. One of the biggest draws of Little Nightmares 2, especially in comparison to the original, is that it focuses really heavily on the teamwork and small moments of kindness or relationship between Six and Mono. In the early game, especially after rescuing her from the hunter, Six seems very trusting of you. She'll hold your hand, help you with hard-to-reach jumps, and just generally be a friendly figure. But after this first TV moment, something has changed between the two of you. She's not against you by any means, but she seems more cautious. Because of the mobile game and the comic, we know a bit about what it must have taken for Six to get to the place she is, and we know that she didn't get here by being sloppy. She's always been cautious, and preferred to keep a distance from everyone else, even when helping them. There's no reason for Six to distrust Mono though, not after he helped her, and clearly, teamwork is not something Six is necessarily opposed to, so their relationship, though essentially wordless except for a lot of the word hey, was comfortable. Now though, Mono represents an uncertainty again. And Six knows what uncertainty can mean if you aren't careful. There's no time to linger on that though, because it's time to talk about it. In the playground outside the school, you can find a destroyed tricycle on the ground. Interestingly, this appears to be the same tricycle depicted being thrown off the school roof in Comic 4 of the digital comics series. I can't help but wonder what happened to the child from the story, though I don't imagine it's anything good. Inside the school, those same porcelain children from the comic are wreaking havoc. These little shitheads are the absolute worst. Clearly, most of the time, they have complete reign over the school, where they set booby traps for each other and destroy anything in their path, or just that they feel like destroying. In almost every room do these little fuckers terrorize you, tackling you, hitting you, and once even managing to separate you from Six, stealing her away and tying her up in a bathroom. In almost every room, but one. The next adult that we have to deal with is an entity known as the Teacher, and all things considered, she might be one of my favorite monsters from the series, for more reasons than just one. The first is that her design is just straight up horrifying. She's at least 4 times as tall as any of the children in her school, porcelain or otherwise. She's oddly one of the happiest looking creatures in the series, with her tight-lipped smile and huge, shining eyes, but like many of the adults in this series, her face and expression seem almost artificial. Like she was simply designed with a smile, and that the emotion she's actually feeling is anything but happy. And listen, I don't mean this as a criticism. I'm not saying it looks like the game designers did a bad job animating her face. I'm saying it looks like whatever creature in-universe put her together did a bad job of doing it. Speaking of in-universe design, you remember how one of those things you were supposed to be looking out for were instances of hidden identity? Well, if you played the series in order, you may have realized that while most of the monsters from the first game hid their identity a bit more noticeably, most of the monsters in this game, save for the hunter at the beginning, don't appear to be wearing a mask at all. One of the only consistent usages of masks in this game is actually from Mono, who is initially depicted wearing a bag on his head but later can pick up a number of other headpieces, all of which mostly hide his identity. That, mixed with the yellow raincoat that Six will find in just a second here, makes our protagonist some of the most shrouded characters that we'll encounter while playing. Of course, this mystery regarding their identities and features raises a significant, if potentially subconscious, question. Are they hiding something? It's a question that we'll have to wait to answer. Returning to this Teacher character, the second thing that is so scary about her is the way that she behaves. Obviously, right? It's a horror game, and she's an enemy. She's obviously going to pursue you, but I don't just mean that. I mean the way she snaps her ruler against her desk, causing the students around her to jump. The way she leans over their shoulders, like real teachers do when they're trying to help you with their work. The way all the rowdy porcelain boys and girls suddenly go still and quiet when she's around. It's like the world is afraid of her, even the other scary parts of the world. Throughout the school, as you avoid the teacher both through stealth and by just booking it, you realize that there's more to how these children are treated than you once thought. Sure, they're little demons, and the reason they run the school is probably because no one wants to fucking deal with that, but in the context of the teacher's involvement with the school and discipline, suddenly the whole scene reeks of neglect, almost. There are children in dunce caps chained up as punishment. Are the violent tendencies of these children nature or nurture? Teachers play a pretty important role in the development of children, which can suck sometimes as it's a generally understaffed field, and that means that sometimes those positions can be filled by people who absolutely should not be teachers. I've encountered that in my own life a number of times. When you have a good teacher, that can make your life, honestly, but if you have a bad one, that can ruin it just as easily. The teacher in Little Nightmares seems to encapsulate every bad quality a person who works with children can have. A penchant for cruelty and violence, an overwhelmingly controlling presence, a seeming delight for dealing discipline. These are qualities which seriously affect a child's trust in himself, other adults, education, and the world around him. Its depiction in Little Nightmares, while exaggerated, is all too accurate to what makes kids hate school and teachers. The little porcelain students are certainly emulatory of bullies, but who do you think taught them? You manage to escape the school by the skin of your teeth, or more accurately, the teachers. There are moments of downtime in between each of the levels of these games, moments where you can breathe and learn a bit about these characters and the city they're traversing through. During one of these moments of downtime between this level and the next, while shivering through the pouring rain, Six finds a yellow raincoat washed out in the street, and there's a dramatic and significant moment, and she picks it up and dons it, revealing that she is, indeed, Six, shocking everyone except anyone who bought the game, because Six was clearly depicted on the cover, which I'm not sure why they did that. Anyway, next up is the hospital. That place is spooky for sure. The hospital section of Little Nightmares is effective primarily due to its focus on using darkness against you. When you enter the building, it almost seems abandoned, with only mannequins taking up the hallways, statuesque and yet still oddly resembling patients to some degree. Their placement and the way they stand or sit, it feels very much like a picture taken of an actual hospital environment. Chaotic and messy, and a range of different maladies on display. This still scene is a snapshot of everything that makes hospitals overwhelming and intimidating, but that stillness pushes it further into a real surreal atmosphere. I'm sure those mannequins won't mean anything later. There are more than one horror to look out for while trying to escape this place. A big part of the reason you can't leave is because the elevator isn't powered, so that means that you and Six have to break into other rooms to find power sources, all while dealing with what might be waiting in those rooms. You find a flashlight in this level, a discovery that might make you immediately concerned for why you'd need it. You get your answer soon enough. As you may have expected, those mannequins from earlier aren't just mannequins. They're patients. Patients of who? Well, be patient, we'll get there in a second. I'm sorry, that wasn't even my script, that was fucking dumb. When the lights go out in a room, something that you might expect to happen when, say, removing a power source from its socket, the patients begin to move in jerky, almost painful-looking motions. They're coming for you, obviously, and what this means is that as you navigate these dark rooms and hallways, you have to be consistently swiveling, keeping your beam pointed on the most important threat. Sometimes there'll be several mannequins in a room, surrounding you on all sides, and you have to perfectly freeze and weave between them. It's very unsettling. These wordless, expressionless figures so seemingly desperate for something. Just to kill? To be saved? To be seen? The question of what could have brought them here, what purpose they might serve, echoes through your mind just like the tap of your shoes on the linoleum floor as you navigate this horror show. This is clearly the place that girl was hidden, you know, the one from the third comic. Truthfully, it's one of the comics I have the hardest time parsing. Where did that spoon come from? Why was she trapped? Is that what happens after a mannequin catches you? All of those questions pale, however, in the face of the most overwhelmingly crucial one. What was that thing that was following her at the end? Well, we find out now. The Doctor is a massive whimpering figure that crawls on the ceiling in this hospital. The forces of gravity over the years have dragged his facial features down, so it always looks like he's sneering, and that his eyes are going to roll out of their sockets and down his wrinkled forehead. The Doctor is the one who's been responsible for making these mannequins. According to the Little Nightmares wiki, a wiki that should be taken with a grain of salt, as it's full of incomplete or incorrect information, the Doctor operates on patients who came to him out of boredom, replacing their fleshy parts with porcelain. Apparently, after he does this, the patients can no longer leave the hospital and are forced to remain here as animated puppets, the mannequins. The mention of porcelain in this description is interesting. Those school children from the last level were all made of porcelain. Is it possible that those school children were once regular children who underwent some kind of replacement? Maybe that's why the Doctor was hunting the girl. The school was about to receive a new student. Regardless, getting around the Doctor is an issue, as he has a very unique perspective on the world. And I don't mean he's a great philosopher. What I mean is, from his vantage point, he can see much more of the room, move around surprisingly quickly, and even lift hiding places out from on top of you, a trick that pretty much no other Little Nightmares enemy has ever been capable of. The Doctor's office is a really scary place for kids, as is the hospital. Unless it's very specifically a children's hospital, the architecture and design of such places can feel cold and overwhelming, and even when it is, that unfamiliarity of the place, especially in the face of discomfort, sickness, or pain, is something that can really intimidate or even scare a child. Mix that with the loss of control that comes, the poking and prodding, and in reality, in intense and unfortunate cases, the cutting and inserting, it can all be very traumatizing. Doctors and nurses, if they're not careful, can take on an almost villainous appearance if their young patient doesn't understand what they're doing, or why, or that long-term, these actions are in their best interest. I remember one of the first shots I had to get as a kid, how I shrieked and squirmed and had to be physically held down by a nurse to receive it. That kind of memory, my disdain for that nurse for taking away my ability to make my own choices, just for that brief instant, was infuriating, and likely why I have such a problem with needles today. Was that nurse evil or even a bad person? Probably not. Certainly not because she was trying to vaccinate a child who couldn't understand why he needed it, but her intentions didn't make her actions any less scary. We don't really know the intentions of the Doctor in Little Nightmares 2, but we can be pretty confident they're not as benevolent as regular health professionals. As we avoid the Doctor, Six and Mono have to deal with a number more mannequins, as well as individual body parts that seem still conscious themselves. The implications of such consciousnesses are complicated. It's also here that we begin to see a fairly concerning shift in Six's behavior. After everything that she's dealt with, it's not surprising that Six has grown rather frustrated with her travels, but now we see a new cruelty coming out of her. In one scene, we lose track of her for a moment, only to discover her violently snapping backwards the fingers on a detached hand. This is not the first time we sense a deeper violence from Six, and it certainly won't be the last. There's not much more left for our protagonist to deal with in the city. The next level isn't really confined to one building so much as it is an exploration through many buildings. Rooms, rooftops, and alleyways that make up the Pale City proper, and during this exploration we finally meet the citizens of this surreal metropolis, and that note about boredom from the hospital level suddenly seems to make a bit more sense. The people here seem broken, mindless, maybe even hypnotized. Their faces are gone, which is ironic as the game refers to them as the Watchers, not to be confused with The Watcher, a mysterious and potentially fabricated stalker who I talked about in a previous video, haha, shameless plug. The reason they're called the Watchers is because they're consistently watching TV, like all of them. You remember that 5th digital comic, the one about the ghost kid? Those two figures, the ones watching the TV, those are clearly Watchers. But what's interesting is that there's 2 of them. They're sitting together, watching in a home that they share. Don't they almost resemble a couple? Maybe even parents? The horror of the Watchers is that they're just normal enough. So much of their appearance is close to what we'd think of as a regular adult. The horror of these characters is that they almost seem to be tragic, like at some point maybe they were normal. That maybe this city used to be full of parents and children and work and play and school and healthcare, and that all of it was corrupted by something. By what? What has been the universal, the constant source of fear and focus? Well, the TVs. The ones being manipulated by the signal tower, the ones that were there from the very beginning of the game, the ones Mono keeps being sucked into. But why? Why do they matter so much? What's in them? The signal tower clearly controls everything, but we still don't know why. When their TVs are turned off, the Watchers get aggressive, angry, and will do anything in their power to access another TV. Making your way through the city, Mono has to use this fact to get around the horrible figures. The TVs are his tool. That is, until the last time he enters a television. Every time Mono has entered this scene, he's managed to get closer and closer to the door, but every time, before he can reach it, he's pulled out. That doesn't happen this time. This time, he makes it to the door, jumps up to the handle, opens it, and reveals the final enemy of the game. A man sitting on a chair, wearing a hat. Except, this man is capable of more than any enemy we've ever seen. Throughout our playthrough, we've encountered these little black echoes all over the place, ghostly figures that seem to resemble children, but that disappear when Mono draws close to them. Now we know what those figures are. They're the echoes of the children that this figure, known as the Thin Man, took. We find this out as the Thin Man manages to exit the TV with Mono, teleports after the fleeing duo, and manages to catch Six, leaving only a shade of her behind. And with that, Mono reaches the end of his journey. Though he's been dragging Six through the streets and buildings with a focus and determination that we could not understand, it now seems that all of the hard work, all of the fear and effort have led to this. Mono runs from the man for as long as he can before finally being cornered by him in an alley. With nothing left to do, Mono puts up his hand as a defense against this terrible figure and realizes he can manipulate the man in quite the same way he'd been manipulating the TVs. This signal, the one being sent out by the tower in the distance, the one that seems so tightly tied to this Thin Man character, is one that Mono seems also tied to. He manages to defeat the Thin Man and is able to manipulate the Pale City to such a degree that suddenly the tower is just in front of him. This is the final goal, the place we've known all of this was leading to. The inside of the tower is probably not what you were expecting. Inside the building, pink light streams from doorways as ethereal singing echoes from places we are simply not certain. This place is more like a dream or potentially nightmare than any level we've encountered before. With all our enemies defeated, that we know of at least, all that's left to do is find Six. She has to be here. It wouldn't make sense for her to be anywhere else. In fact, the song coming from each of the doorways is the very same song Six had been listening to when Mono found her in the woods all those hours ago, I guess? It's wild. It feels like you've been through so much together, you and Six, but in reality, you barely know each other and have only been in close proximity for a short time. But surely that's enough to trust Six, isn't it? Enough to make it an imperative that you find her, rescuing her again. Eventually, you do find her. You follow that music to a room with a music box and a monstrous, mutated version of Six. Dear God, what did this place do to her? Her existence seems terrifying, even to herself, and much like from the beginning of the story, only the quiet, gentle, and almost haunting tones of her music box seem to bring her peace. You smash the music box. Screw her peace, you have to get out of here. It takes a couple hits to fully destroy the music box, and during this process, the mutated version of Six is getting incredibly mad. She's screaming, trying to attack you and guarding the music box with her long, spindly hands. It takes abusing the nonsensical dream logic of this place to trick her into leaving her box unattended for just a few moments at a time, and each time you hit it, the world seems to echo, and you get a peek at this dark, strange place behind the curtain of reality. On the last hit of the box, though, you see the truth. A massive carrion wall of watching eyes and bubbling flesh makes up the true essence of the signal tower. There's no answer here, no sudden realization about the true nature of all of this world, only another detail to add to the confusion. But there's no time to think about that. With the last smash of the music box, 6 is freed, returning to her regular form, but that wall of flesh, like some monster out of Terraria, begins expanding and chasing after 6 in mono, absolutely wrecking the tower and causing the terrain to splinter and crumble under your feet. 6 has a head start on you for some reason, and as you flee the incoming wall of gore, you remain at her heels, the ground giving way closer and closer to your feet until you're right by the exit on a thin platform that gives way well before you reach the end. 6 is at the other end, and for a moment while you're running, the game dramatically putting this desperate scene in slow motion, you might remember that very first moment of teamwork at the bridge, 6 standing in a very similar place to where she is now, you flying through the air, your faith fully placed in this little girl who never speaks, and you think to yourself, she'll catch me, right? She'll catch me, just like the last time and every time before, right? She wouldn't just let me fall. And you're right, she wouldn't. 6 catches your hand, and for a moment, you dangle there, looking up into the shrouded face of the girl you've dragged through hell. The one who was strung up by porcelain bullies, the one who was attacked by disembodied hands and groaning monsters, the one who followed you despite you only bringing her into more and more dangerous situations. And though the two of you have never really spoken to each other, and though you cannot even fully see the girl's expression, as you hang there in her grasp, a puzzle piece clicks into place a moment too late. 6 wasn't your friend. She was just someone who happened to be in the same place you were. She was never kind, she was just doing what she had to do to survive. She was never altruistic, she just knew she'd have an easier time navigating this fucked up world if she could count on another person. These are the realizations that come as the puzzle pieces complete the picture in your head, the one built from minor scenes of violence or cruelty or willingness to hurt people to reach her goals, and even just because, that puzzle piece allows you to finally spell out the message that has been being built in your head over the course of your entire playthrough. You shouldn't have trusted 6. She lets you go. Betrayal, remember? One of those crucial elements to watch out for. If only Mono had known. 6 drops you. Why, we cannot be fully sure. She's an enigma even under the best of circumstances. But truthfully, it's a moment we should have seen coming, especially if we played the games in order. 6 is so much more than just a little kid. But we can't focus on 6 now. She's gone, leaving through the doorway to some unknown place as we, Mono, fall into the gurgling flesh and are consumed. And finally, the real end of Little Nightmares 2 arrives. We find ourselves in a pit, surrounded on all sides by emotionless but ever-watching eyes. Sat there in this hellscape of ceaseless watching, we're almost consumed by the mass but are able to avoid it, utilizing that strange power we have access to once again, forcing the mass away and changing the setting so it resembles a more regular room. It's almost like you're hiding the truth from yourself, dreadfully aware that the eyes are still there but unwilling to subject yourself to their constant gaze. There's no way out of this place, not that you can see. In fact, all that seems to be around you is a chair. You take a seat and wait. You wait for years. You grow up in that chair. First, an older child. Then a teen. Then a young adult, then a man, the whole time growing and growing, growing taller than a regular adult would be, thinner than you might normally be. As you age, your style changes, becoming more formal, a suit, and then, additionally, a hat. It's over the course of your entire life, sat in that room, waiting, that you realize who you really are.
why you could control the TVs, and by extension, the signal, why that thin man kept following you, why you kept having that dream. The man was you. Maybe blinded and warped by the years, or maybe just trying to break the cycle, to stop himself from being betrayed by that little girl in the raincoat, to escape the room that he had spent his entire childhood running towards. It's a doomed narrative, a cycle. The game ends the way it begins. A long, twisting hallway with a door at the end. Except this time we know what's behind the door. We know what happens next, and again, and again, and again. What we don't know is what happened to 6. We tend to see ourselves as the heroes of our own story. When we decide that a belief or course of action is the correct one, whatever that word may mean in the context, then it is so. Those who work in pursuit or support of your decreed morality are the good guys, and those who do not, well, those are the bad guys. In Little Nightmares 2, we play as Mono the whole time, and only ever see things from Mono's perspective. When we're separated from 6, we see how much we have to go through to rescue her, but not what she had to go through during her own capture. When we work together with 6, we can only assume what she's thinking and hope it's similar to what we're thinking. She's a silent protagonist. We don't need to hear what 6 thinks about what's happening to her because we're controlling her and should be thinking similar enough things ourselves, as long as we're properly invested. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, when 6 drops us and walks away, we don't see where she goes. We don't know why she does it, why she lingered, staring at our face for so long. We only see it as a betrayal. But is it? We, playing as Mono, saw ourselves as the hero of our own story. But that was a mistake. It wasn't our story. Welcome back, Boneheads, to our in-depth look into the universe of Little Nightmares. This is part 2 of the exploration. We established a bunch of things in the first video that are going to be important to keep in mind going forward. Stuff like COHOB, an acronym I came up with to help us keep track of certain recurring themes and ideas, as well as a number of thoughts about the children, 6, and Mono, and their place in all of this. I don't think you'll be lost necessarily if you want to start with this video, and it may even make more sense, since we'll be looking a lot more closely at the first game in this one, but I'd still recommend watching the other first. For one thing, I worked really hard on it, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it, but for another thing, it also gives some context to the point I'm about to make next. I treated 6 very harshly in the last video. You may have already felt me amping up to this explanation in my introduction, but here it comes. The ending of Little Nightmares 2 can be viewed in 2 very different ways. The first is the way I outlined in my original video, with the idea that 6 has betrayed Mono and that we have been too optimistic about our relationship with her. This betrayal comes from nowhere and dooms us. This is the perspective a person will likely come to if their first game in the series is Little Nightmares 2, or I guess if they watch my first video. The second perspective, though, actually still centers around betrayal, that being Mono's betrayal of 6. But before we talk about that, we need to talk about 2 contrasting priorities: survival versus heroics. See, as we've laid out a bit already and will continue to unravel, it's not just one unique location in the nowhere that seems dangerous for children, it's the nowhere itself. What this means is that to survive in a place like this, one has to develop a personality or thought process that specifically works towards keeping them alive over anything else. This isn't unique to Little Nightmares, this is just what happens when you have to live long-term under stressful or dangerous conditions. In the real world, psychologists call this an enduring personality change, which is pretty self-explanatory. It seems to me that Mono and 6 have both developed some pretty extreme and distinct personalities in response to the Nowhere's tomfuckery. Mono has developed a kind of hero streak and seems to be actively seeking out danger in some belief that he can change it or affect it in some way. His behavior throughout Little Nightmares 2 backs this up. He rescues 6, which is nice, but after the hunter is shot, he leads her to the city. There was nothing to indicate further monstrous adults in this forest area other than maybe some stuffed corpses in the house, but for some reason, Mono goes incredibly far out of his way to put the 2 of them back in the reach of danger. It may simply be the call of the signal tower influencing him or something deeper, some fateful inevitability. Maybe there was nothing here for them, but either way, the choice is active. 6, though, has gone almost in the opposite direction. She's become avoidant, seemingly happier by herself and unnoticed. Even during her first appearance in the timeline, as the girl in white in Very Little Nightmares, she stays out of reach, helping but never going so far to put herself in real danger.
And why would she? She's still alive, so something about this process has been working. It's possible to utilize your decreased size to trick and confuse opponents, but it's a lot easier to just avoid them in general. After the first couple times Mono drags Six into hell, it's not hard to understand why she'd get a little upset about it. So let's return to that moment in the tower, to Mono dangling from Six's grasp. When I narrated the scene in the last video, I narrated it from Mono's perspective, as he made a deep and horrible realization about his companion. Let's go over that scene again, considering Six's point of view. A point of view that, as many of you have pointed out in the comments of the last video, is perhaps skewed by the fact that Six doesn't recognize Mono. Before Mono entered the signal tower, he removed the bag on his head. At the time, it seemed like a moment of surrender, Mono finally letting himself be completely vulnerable to this world after an eternity of running, but maybe it was something else. When Six takes Mono's hand, does she recognize him? It's hard to say. She's never seen his face, and even though he's wearing the same clothes, and it would be a pretty strange coincidence if he was somebody else, Six has been through a lot and might not know for sure. Even if she suspects it, we already know Six tends to be overly cautious, so maybe the drop was simply a response to uncertainty. Or maybe she did recognize Mono as the Thin Man. I gotta say, it's really fun having an active comment section for videos like these, because a lot of you guys notice things that I don't, or make connections that I wouldn't. Like, for instance, the fact that, as we mentioned earlier, there is another gap of time between Six's kidnapping by the Thin Man and the point where she's rescued by Mono. During that time, it's pretty likely she'd have the opportunity to get a better look at the Thin Man, the very same Thin Man, I'll remind you, that Mono will go on to become because of these moments. In all the time that Mono's been running with Six, he's been hiding his identity. The very first time Six is really able to look at Mono's face, with him bagless and at her mercy, what if Six realizes that Mono is the same person who's been menacing her the whole time she's been in the Pale City? What if Six thinks that by doing this, she's breaking the very cycle that she's actually putting in motion? Does she realize what she's done? Violence is always a cycle. To clarify, I mean the beginning of Little Nightmares as a whole, not the timeline. If you collect all 18 of the little glitchy child souls that are scattered throughout the game, you get a special ending to Little Nightmares 2, where Six emerges from a TV alone and encounters a glitchy version of herself. That version looks towards a pamphlet on the ground, then disappears without a trace. Six looks towards the pamphlet. She's gotta keep moving, and that seems like a place enough to go. When Mono and Six pushed that door out to sea, did they realize what they were pushing towards? Who knows? The same question applies to this scene. The place that Six is going isn't a place any normal kid would ever dream of going to of their own volition. But of course, Six is not a normal kid. Little Nightmares begins with a vision. Out of a drifting, ethereal darkness emerges a figure. A woman, tall, elegant, but out of focus, shrouded in a familiar darkness and thrumming tones, turned slowly towards the camera as if becoming aware of her own observation. She almost seems to recognize the viewer, and just as we begin to make out her features, we awaken with a start. Finally, for the first time in the timeline, we control Six. For new players, this is a completely brand new character. They likely don't even know her name. But we boneheads have done the work. We know a lot about her at this point. Not enough, per se, but we're also not completely in the dark this time. We know her name, where she came from, and what she's seen. The first moments of the game are what you might expect. Quiet, in a way, and devoid of enemies, taking the time to set up the atmosphere of this location, a shifting, groaning, and of course, completely oversized place called the Maw. It's the location that was depicted on the pamphlet Six found in the secret ending. Six has a light source from the beginning of the game this time, a lighter, which does very little to illuminate anything other than the spaces just in front and around the little girl in the raincoat. The empty echoes of this place, this groaning, indicative of huge steel-lined rooms and chambers, are punctuated by the quiet taps of your tiny bare feet against cold, damp metal. For first-time players, the anticipation, the intrigue, the dread, it's all palpable. The introduction to a horror game can be long, drawn out, and bring replay value to a screeching halt, or it can be like this: short, sweet, quiet, and jam-packed with subtlety. Immediately, you may notice that the environment of this game is much more industrial than its sequel. As I mentioned in the last video, this game is shorter and takes place in a much more confined location, despite its size. Because of this, there's a greater consistency to the design of every scene. Of course, in those surreal, uneven shapes that the series is known for, but also in how pipes snake through most levels, how metal and concrete make up the underbelly of this place, and how there seems to be a constant rocking, like a ship at sea. The environment of the Maw is distinct and oppressively unique. I should also note here that 6's progression through the game is sort of a climb through the hierarchy of the Maw's inhabitants. The first places you encounter are the behind-the-scenes staging areas of this place, and from there you move on to dealing with the staff for this location, then the customers, and then finally, the owner or leader of all of this. And I use the word climb very intentionally. As you'll see in this introduction, it seems like you begin the game in one of the lowest areas of the Maw, and in your path towards escape, or whatever it is you're seeking, you consistently move upwards, climbing ropes and walls, stairs, being carried by automated hooks. This is 6's climb to the top, both literally and metaphorically, but we're getting ahead of ourselves, as always. After doing some minor exploration, we come to a room with a chair, a note, and a pair of thin, dangling legs suspended above them, the rest of his body out of frame and unrecognizable. The implications of this scene are clear, but there's also a strange familiarity to it all. A comment on my last video pointed out to me that the inclusion of the chair and the distinctly thin and human-seeming legs might imply that at some point since his time in the Pale City, Mono, or the Thin Man, or whatever you prefer to call him, eventually realized the terrible nature of the cycle he was stuck in and decided to end it on his own terms. Why would he be here on the Maw? Well, who's to say? I'd be willing to guess it's for 6, not intentionally by the Thin Man himself, but rather as a sort of sign from the nowhere. Interestingly, there's actually a painting of the scene in the app Very Little Nightmares. Does this mean that the man has been hanging here since before any of the games even started? Or, more realistically, does it imply some sort of prophetic nature to this world? We already know that time functions differently in the nowhere. Maybe someone knew this man, whoever he was going to take these actions well before he did. In any case, whoever this man is, our finding him gives us a really bad feeling about what we're about to encounter. The note on the ground implies he expected to be found. By whom? We don't read the note, but someone working down here, in a place like this, surrounded by terrible monsters and scared kids, there's the implication of guilt, of no longer being able to take part in such a horrific system. Whether or not this is Mono, a point is made. During this introduction, we also meet the gnomes, these little white-hatted creatures who skitter around anxiously but seem to be mostly friendly. 6 seems to have a friendly relationship with them, and you can go out of your way to hug them if you choose. It's nice. At least you have a few friendly faces around. It's kind of weird, after Little Nightmares 2, being alone like this, but I get the feeling 6 is much more comfortable in this kind of situation. There's an extra layer of dwarving by the world, which obviously is so much bigger than you, but now you don't have anyone else to empathize with, to make you at least a little bigger as a unit. However, getting around, being stealthy, and not having to deal with Mono's wild streak makes the admittedly oppressive atmosphere of the game something of a safety. Sure, it's dark and scary, but you can hide in the darkness just as well, if not better, than everything else here. That point might be hard to believe, however, as from a distance, we encounter the first monstrous figure we'll have to deal with in this series. A long-limbed, blindfolded creature, dragging what looks like a cage behind him on a platform not too far above us. What could that cage be for? There's still a little we have to get through before reaching his workshop, and during that exploration, we become aware of 2 facts. 1, there are other kids here for sure. 2, it is not safe to be a kid here. We enter what appears to be a nursery filled with children, and though it's a strange and potentially shocking reveal, we have no time to investigate. The door opens, and we're forced to scramble for hiding place as a figure known as the janitor enters the room. He emits a sound like creaking wooden planks as he feels around in the dark. We're not sure what he's doing here, but even by this point we know better than to panic and sprint away. We've got to be stealthy now. After we avoid him the first time, something unexpected happens. 6's stomach starts growling. I guess in all the time we've spent with her, we've never really seen her eat. Usually that's just video game logic. Unless it's part of the healing system or something, you can just accept that your protagonist doesn't have to eat. But of course, in this universe, consumption and the differences between the ways people do it is a big deal, and so the fact that Six hasn't eaten anything is a problem. She walks slowly, in pain, through the room as a ravenous hunger overtakes her, and she's lucky enough to be thrown a piece of bread by a shrouded kid in the other room. There's no further communication between the two, but it's a rare moment of benevolence. Fun fact, in the Little Nightmares wiki, that boy is simply called the bread-giving boy. Accurate. We have another moment of hunger a little while later after doing some more work to advance through the maw. This time, though, we're not in a place where any altruistic child can help us. We're deep in the hall, away from everyone, or so we thought. There's a moment, limping in your hunger, that you encounter an open cage with a piece of meat in it. Six isn't stupid. She knows that this has to be a trap, just as we as the player know it's a trap, but the hunger is too great. She must eat. It doesn't matter the consequences. And so you enter the cage and begin to eat. And just as you do, a long, lanky hand shuts the door, and the scene ends. We wake up in a room surrounded by other children in cages. One of them is being dragged away by those same long limbs. We need to find out where. Six manages to escape, and instead of helping her fellow captives, decides to drag one of the filled cages over towards a lever so she can escape. It's cold, sure, but what is Six gonna do? Try to guide 5 or 6 kids through extreme danger, all while dealing with hunger and monsters much larger than her? She's already tried traveling with another, and she's over it. In the next room, we see what the janitor is doing with the kids. As we sneak by him at his workbench, we see him pull the limp form of a child from a collection and begin wrapping it. Hooks on an automatic conveyor belt pass over him. Something about the scene, about the way the corpses are being prepared, starts to put a dreadful feeling in your gut. We narrowly avoid the janitor again, escaping through an air duct, and find ourselves in a new location. One that... Jesus Christ. Okay, fair warning, I'm going to briefly talk about something very real and potentially very upsetting. So if you're just here for the Little Nightmare stuff, skip to this time code. If you've never been to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., this imagery might not be quite as hard-hitting as it would be otherwise, but let me explain what's happening here. There's a rather famous exhibit in the museum which many people refer to as the Last Witnesses exhibit, which is simply an exhibit that has been filled with the shoes of Jewish people who were killed in concentration camps during the Holocaust. It's an extremely horrifying exhibit, as it only represents a fraction of the lives lost during that time, and on the wall of that exhibit is a haunting poem by Yiddish poet Moses Schulstein that reads as follows: "We are the shoes, we are the last witnesses. We are shoes from grandchildren and grandfathers, from Prague, Paris, and Amsterdam. And because we are only made of fabric and leather, and not of blood and flesh, each one of us avoided the hellfire." It is an exhibit and poem that uniquely illustrate just how horrible these killings were, how senseless, how non-human they were. That might seem like a silly statement. Of course the killings were horrific, but it's more than that. The Nazis weren't just killers, they were thieves too. And as that poem lays out, the fact that the Nazis kept the shoes but killed the people wearing them is heartbreaking. Now, the inclusion of this kind of imagery is sort of strange in this game, and it's clearly pretty loaded. I don't think this setting is going so far as to overtly politicize the actions of the monsters in this game, or to imply that this game as a whole is a Holocaust metaphor. However, it does serve to recontextualize the scale and brutality of the operation. This isn't just a few kids, it isn't just you. This inclusion makes its point clear and unavoidable. This is a genocide, and it's happening to kids. They're seen as expendable, a product, livestock. Before we even know what is fully being done to these children, we know how horrible it must be. Their shoes and suitcases and whatever else they have are tossed aside as their personality and personhood is stripped away from them, and they just become another corpse in the process. And as we process this, even being pursued by an unknown entity beneath the mass of faded leather, a new reaction begins to spark. Anger. You really can't catch a break from the janitor by this point. He pursues you frantically throughout stages and rooms, and the only way you manage to survive is by abusing the fact that apparently this guy is blind. On first glance, it almost looks like he's hiding his eyes with a blindfold, but further inspection proves that he has none in the first place, that it's actually his face, or maybe a mask, slipping away from the strange, smooth marble that is his real skull. What this means is that you can walk right in front of the janitor, as long as you do so quietly, and with this new information, we managed to start making some progress as we move forward. You hide beneath floorboards, in cubbies and adjacent rooms as you work to avoid the janitor until finally he corners you in a room with a falling heavy metal door. You're able to slide under completely, but the janitor can only get his lanky arms through. The door is being held up by a damaged cage, and as the janitor feels around the room, something hits you. This man, the one who's been chasing you, the one who likely filled that room with shoes in the first place, who has sent child after child to their death, if not killing them himself, can't see you, and further, can't see what you're doing to the cage under the door. Winston Churchill once said, "Beware of driving men to desperation. Even a cornered rat is dangerous." Churchill was a British leader during World War II. Those words were not spoken without experience. It's hard being the little guy. It's hard existing at the whims of everyone else just because they're bigger than you. Not smarter, not better, just bigger. People can get away with doing whatever they want to you because what are you going to do about it? What can you do about it? The greatest strength that any child has is their understanding that they're being underestimated. Enough is enough. Obviously, this is not the first time Six has been violent in the timeline. We covered in the last video a couple instances where Six exhibited violent tendencies. However, most of these were vague and random, or part of a larger sequence of actions that Mono was also a part of. This is, however, the first time in-game, and it sets a tone for the rest of the game that is really fascinating to consider. No matter how you feel about Six and what she's capable of, you have to admit that for the majority of the time we've spent with her in this series, she's been a victim. She's been trapped multiple times, attacked, mutated, and so on and so forth. There's rarely a time where Six is fully in control of the situation, as is just the nature of the nowhere, and this fact is likely what led to her being such a reserved and cautious explorer. However, now, after this fight with the janitor, hearing his cries of pain from behind the shut door as we continue onwards, I feel a new emotion begins to settle onto Six's shoulders. Frustration. Not at anyone in particular, but rather at the world, at every monster as a whole, and maybe even herself. She's been traveling for so long and in so many different places, but every time, no matter what, the story is always the same. She's always on the run, always being chased, always having to fight just to exist in a world that seems entirely made up of problems and zero solutions. She's always hid, always preferred avoiding the danger, going in the opposite direction, leaving well enough alone, but it doesn't work. Not really. Of course, she's alive, but she's menaced by these towering figures every day. Something has to change, and if it's not going to be the world, it's going to have to be her. Six has to stop being a pushover. Before Six moves on to the next full stage, she becomes hungry again. There's no bread boy or convenient trap this time. There's only a cornered rat. Desperation drives people to do some pretty scary things. The twins are grotesque. Their eyes roll back in their heads as if they're in a trance. They move in jerky, uncontrolled motions, and their voices are these breathy, squeaking croaks of exertion and raw emotion. Dealing with the chefs actually takes a lot less than dealing with the janitor. While they can see, their range of motion is pretty limited, and in this sense, Six is able to return to a style of avoidance that's much more typical for her. Sprinting, climbing, and sliding out of the way of reach works very well with these lads in particular, and the only real threat to consider specifically is the fact that there are two of them to account for. However, the twin chefs seem uncomfortably close, so getting them apart isn't really the most effective course of action. Better to just use their size and speed against them, ducking out of the way before they can catch you and sprinting away when they do. It is during your exploration of the chef's kitchen that you may put together what exactly the janitor was packaging those children for, and why so many kids are being kept in cages down below. There's a lot of meat in the kitchen, some of which appears to be seafood, but most of which doesn't. There's been no indication of actual livestock up until this point, and it makes sense that you would have encountered it if it were here on your way up to the kitchen, so the meat must be coming from somewhere else. Probably the meat hooks, the ones the janitor was putting the kids on after he finished wrapping them up. Huh. Watching the chefs chop brutally at the meat on the table as if they're angry at it, or maybe taking pleasure in the process, hits different now that we know what the meat might be. You may also notice during this section how occasionally the chefs will reach up under their faces and scratch at something. They're wearing masks. There is so much to the enemies in this game, in the way that they're presented and their mysteries are hidden from us. Learning that the chefs are wearing masks actually doesn't tell us anything about their characters or their place in the game. It really only brings up more questions and makes the setting feel that much more alien and surreal. Are the people who hide their identities in this way ashamed of the way they look? Are they worried they'll be recognized by someone? Have they been compelled by another force to act this way? We can really only guess, and it's these kind of thoughts that we're having as we scramble our way through the kitchens and lockers until we finally reach the end of the stage, pursued manically by the twin chefs, and are able to ride the meat hooks to safety. We don't kill the chefs, but their cries of anger and frustration as we drift further and further out of their reach is nearly as satisfying as that action might have felt. But it's time to see who they were cooking for. Holy shit, we're in the middle of the ocean. This reveal is pretty stunning, especially the way it introduces us to the antagonist of the next stage. See, we likely could have guessed from the motion of the camera and some other environmental clues that we are out at sea, but the reveal of these people arriving via ship from somewhere else to this secluded and horrible spot right out in the middle of the sea, it paints a clear picture about what exactly is going on. This place, the Maw, it's a place you go when you want to do terrible things with little repercussions. The Maw is a cannibalistic vacation destination, and the tourists are looking hungry. But who could have, or rather, would have set up a place like this? As we climb further and further into the Maw, we see her. Briefly silhouetted in the window, the woman from our dream at the beginning. She's looking down at the shambling patrons as they pass by below her, her face still shrouded. There's something different about her. She has a calmness about her, a distinct aura of control that no other monster has ever exhibited, but we'll get to her in a moment. First, we have to make our way through the feast. Our suspicions about this place are quickly proven correct as we leave our view of the lady and continue into the center of the main event. These bulbous figures are sat at tables everywhere, loaded with only meat and wine, and they shovel food into their mouth with such avarice and desperation that it's almost like they've never eaten before in their lives, and yet of course that couldn't be true, not with their statures and clear familiarity with this environment. Their desperation is founded on the quality of their meat. They don't get to have food like this anywhere else. As you pass by these creatures, the ones that notice you become immediately and incredibly aggressive, knocking over furniture and kitchenware as they crawl after you, licking their lips maniacally and stirring the whole collective into a chaos, like a feeding frenzy of bulbous sharks. They almost lose their human quality by the end of this pursuit and take on more of the identity of a wave, a singular flowing mass of hungry flesh. It's oddly similar to the ending of Little Nightmares 2, except the stakes of this chase are so much clearer. There's food all around them, but they only want you. You escape, barely, and I love this moment where one of your pursuers falls over the edge of the railing as you avoid their reach. You had to do some mono-ass shit to get through this scene, getting right up close and personal with these people as you run on their tables, jump on their backs, and generally just outsmart them without spending any time on stealth. Maybe there's something to be said about direct action. Maybe you can do something to change this place. Not the Nowhere as a whole, that would be ridiculous, but maybe just the Maw. There has to be a solution here, a reason that things have happened to you in this way, in this order. But you're hungry again. It's worse than it's ever been. You encounter a gnome. A friendly face, thank God. He's holding a sausage. He even has food for you. You approach him and take the— Oh my God! What? Oh my God. What? Why did— 6? Alright, so here we go. Let's address this. Remember that introduction I gave about reinterpreting Little Nightmares 2 from 6's perspective and trying to be more forgiving than I was in my first video? I have a confession. All of that was a lie, and I knew it when I was writing it because of this moment right here. Every person in my comments who likes 6 over Mono loves to imply that 6 isn't a cruel or evil person, she's just a child making a quick decision about a person who admittedly did put her in a lot of danger. However, what the fuck is this scene then? What part of this decision can be explained as pragmatic or normal for a kid to do? The gnome was literally holding food out to her, and she ate him. This wasn't even one of the enemies who's been menacing her. The gnomes in these games have only been nice to you. Even as a product of trauma, which that's not what this is, are you kidding me? This type of action can only be described as malicious. There's simply no other word for it. So, I'm gonna go ahead and stand by one of my final conclusions from the first video and restate it here, not directed towards the character Mono this time, but you, the player, who has likely spent your entire playthrough believing you understand 6 as her controller. But you aren't her controller. You didn't make the choice to eat the gnome, she did, and therefore your connection to her isn't what you thought it was, and therefore my original claim of you shouldn't have trusted 6 is still pretty goddamn accurate. And by the way, before I get the comment, she's been dealing with a lot and isn't thinking clearly, let me get ahead of that and say, that's dumb. Eating another person is pretty morally black and white, and yes, the gnomes are people. The DLC proves this. Anyway, I needed to get that off my chest, especially since so many of the comments called me out for not analyzing 6 properly. Oh, by the way, she's gonna eat another person. So, here we are. The end of the game, finally facing the last boss, the taste of gnomish blood still fresh on our lips. The lady is unlike any Little Nightmares character we've ever seen, in this game or the next. She is thin, controlled, and more human in her appearance than anything we've ever seen. I'd like now to bring your attention to a pretty popular theory regarding 6 and the lady, and explain why people think that 6 might be her daughter, or something similar to that. As you navigate the lady's bedroom, you might notice a number of pictures hanging on the walls, some of which are obscured with sheets. There are 3 specifically that people tend to point out. On the stairs, there's an image of what looks like the lady and 4 other similar figures. This obviously adds up to 5, and considering that your name is 6, is it possible that you were supposed to be the next in that group of figures, whatever they might represent? In an empty bedroom that might belong to the lady, but more realistically belong to someone else, there's a painting of a little girl in a ratty white dress. You may recall that all the way back in Very Little Nightmares, the character that was revealed to be 6 was referred to, at the time, as the girl in white, and had a similar white dress. Just beneath the picture of the girl in white is an obscured painting of another child. Most of the painting is hidden and you can't make out the features of the child, however, you can make out the shape and color of their clothes, which appears to be a yellow raincoat, or at least something similar. There are also clear marks on the wall nearby implying that paintings were at one point hanging, likely for a while, before being taken down and covered up. If 6 was the lady's daughter and she ran away or betrayed her for some reason, maybe she was so distraught that she couldn't bear to look at her face anymore. Perhaps the reason 6 came to the Maw in the first place is to finally face the truth about herself she was too afraid to back in the day. I don't know if I believe this theory. I think it's interesting, and I think that if it is true, it explains a lot, but Little Nightmares is sort of defined by its ambiguity, at least now. What is really interesting is the way that the lady seems obsessed with her appearance, but always breaks her mirrors. What does she see that upsets her so much? You face off against the lady. It feels oddly inevitable when it happens, as if everything has been leading up to this, and even 6 knows it. The atmosphere almost implies that this interaction with the lady has been what everything was leading up towards, that this fight is intentional in a way that every other before was not. Those fights were for survival. This one is for control. You use a mirror against the woman as she circles you, teleporting in and out of view, attempting to rush you, and each time you hold her appearance up to her, it seems to hurt her, until finally, the mirror shatters in your hands, and the lady collapses to the floor. You consume her, much in the same way you did the gnome, and as you do, her power, this drifting darkness, fills you. This consumption isn't just a killing blow. You're taking something from her, becoming something different. After everything you've been through, this game and the last and the app, and who even knows before that, you finally put your foot down and refuse to be a victim anymore. And that means refusing to be a child, or at least just a child. There's no place for regular children in this world, and so you stop being one, if you could ever claim to have been one in the first place. As a new power fills your tiny body, you look back at the camera, slowly, intentionally, just like the woman did in your vision at the very beginning of the game. Violence is always a cycle. As you leave the maw, walking slowly to the front door, you pass by all the cannibals again. Each of them reach for you, desperate and hungry, but you pay them no mind. That darkness that came to you, it remains with you now, and every disgusting man and woman that you pass, that want only to decimate you into nothing more than filling for their stomachs, dies at your feet, killed by the power of the very woman who brought them here, who made their violence possible. It is exactly what they deserve. And with that, 6 is free. Free to do what, or to go where? Well, maybe the new game will tell us. I want to talk to you about people. Not kids or adults, not specifically, at least. I mean, just people. Everyone, humans, if you want to be specific about it. We get really good at separation, us people, and the times we're best at it is when it comes to ourselves. We separate ourselves by gender or age, maybe race, maybe something less tangible like wealth or belief. It doesn't have to be huge or aggressive or noticeable at all, really, for it to be true. We like seeing the differences between ourselves. At the end of the day, though, it doesn't really matter. We're all pretty alike in the ways that count, and I don't mean it in a feel-good optimism kind of way. I mean that we all share a darkness, a creature. I mentioned it in the intro to the first video, but I don't think I ever really clarified what I meant at the time, or maybe I only implied it. I've tried to separate these videos, one about adults and the other about kids, the first one for mono and the second for 6, but it's been foolish, really. If you take a step back and look at it, really take in the salty air and the sounds of distant chimes, the truth we've been amping up to reveals itself, the puzzle I keep mentioning finally coming together, at least in one way. It's a simple observation, really, one that's so obvious it almost feels like a joke to hype it up like this. Here it is. It doesn't matter how old we are, what power we hold, what reason we give for the strange actions we take. The truth is, we are all about the same in one undeniable way. We are all terrible. As 6 walked up that long staircase out of the maw and into the light, a bunch of those little pointy-hatted creatures, the gnomes, watched her go. You remember the gnomes, right? 681? Yeah, you remember. I think we've learned by now that trying to guess what exactly is going on in the head of any character in this universe is a fool's errand, so realistically, we have no idea how the gnomes gathered at the base of the stairs feel about the events that recently transpired. Do they know that the lady is dead? Do they care? Are they even capable of enough thought to recognize that a change has occurred at all? And if so, how do they feel about 6 eating one of them? Is that why they don't follow her up? There are many questions, and if you stop playing Little Nightmares where I stopped talking about it in the last video, most of them will remain unanswered. However, if you're a super sleuth like me, you may notice there's a DLC for the game. You might call it The Secrets of the Maw, and you might call it that because that's the DLC's name, but I prefer to refer to it by its real title. Gnome Quest 2017! Gnome Quest 2017. The 2017 is there because the game came out in 2017. It's called Gnome Quest because it's a quest about gnomes. But all joking aside, the Little Nightmares DLC gives some really interesting context and insight to the rest of the series. There are a lot of minor details hidden throughout the side story that are worth mentioning. I don't have a theory for all of them, but sometimes you can just tell when something is relevant, even if you don't specifically know why. It's not really necessary to go through the DLC with the same hyper-focus that we analyzed the mainline games through, so I'll only be mentioning the essential moments that happen in my summary, unless there's a specific detail that adds to what we've already been talking about. But before we do that, I think we should go back to Six's last interaction with the gnomes. You know, the time where she ate one? As per usual, the way that people interpret that scene is incredibly varied and nuanced. Obviously, I hyperbolically interpreted it one way in my analysis. What the fuck is this scene then? But plenty of people see it in a different, more forgiving way. As mentioned in the last video, we're pretty certain by this point, as is likely Six, that the meat being served in the maw is human meat, and probably mostly children. So when the gnome holds the meat out to Six, it's possible, in a starved delirium, that she chooses to eat him because she's disgusted by the alternative. Now, I think this is an ethically dubious choice, as she's actively choosing to kill something instead of eating what's already dead. It's kind of the weirdest trolley problem I've encountered in a while, and that's why I prefer another theory. But it's one we'll talk about later. For now, let's focus on a specific line I included in the last video. Eating another person is pretty morally black and white, and yes, the gnomes are people. The DLC proves this. Now yes, obviously Six didn't know that this gnome was a person. Probably, hopefully, but the main takeaway I want you to have is that, like everything in this place, there's a reason that the gnomes are here. Usually we have to make peace with not knowing that reason, but Gnome Quest, as I am going to continue to call it, throws us a bone. Gnome Quest also begins with a vision. But interestingly, this seems to be the only vision that doesn't give any warning about the game's conclusion. Mono's vision in Little Nightmares 2 was of the door that he would eventually be trapped behind by the game's end, and Six's vision in the first game was of the lady who she'd go on to consume. The vision of this new character, a person known as the Runaway Kid, is of himself treading water for a moment before he's pulled beneath the surface of the water, and wakes with a jolt in a rather familiar location. We'll find out shortly that this vision really only resembles the contents of the first chapter of this DLC, so after that point, we're operating almost completely in the dark. At least in character. The place we wake up is that nursery where we first encountered the janitor as Six in the main game. It appears that this DLC takes place during approximately the same time as Little Nightmares, and in fact, we even get to see a brief glimpse of Six during our playthrough, as she passes through the shoe room we discussed in the last video. And a note about that. In the last video, I implied that the shoes here all belonged to the children being slaughtered for the feast, but as some of you correctly pointed out, many of the shoes appear to be bigger than any child would wear, raising the question again of who could they have belonged to? Are they the shoes of the guests? Are the guests also being killed? What other reason might there be for them leaving shoes behind? This universe is confusing sometimes, a lot of the time, most of the time. The kid sees a little girl with a flashlight in the distance. She has no interest in communicating with us in a way that is very reminiscent of Six's behavior, but things go a lot worse for her than they normally do for Six. As we follow her through these first couple stages, it becomes clear to us that the path we're taking is opposite to the path that Six will take during her introduction. In fact, the girl that you're following lowers and climbs down a makeshift rope that you will very likely remember climbing up as Six in the main game. Despite moving in opposite directions, it seems that your goal is the same: to get off of this godforsaken place. But while Six moves up, the kid moves down. You may notice at some point during this introduction that there's a shackle around the kid's leg. We already know that the kids are trapped here against their will, and this just serves to give us another horrible reminder of that. The kid doesn't ever really seem to acknowledge it, though. He's gotten used to it, it would seem. Eventually, we encounter a flashlight on the ground in a room filled with black leeches, and we stop seeing the girl after this point, so it seems pretty likely she was killed at some point off screen. Rip flashlight girl. We end up in this place called the Depths. It's a collection of rooms at the very bottom of the maw that seem to have served different purposes initially, but have since flooded and been invaded by a disgusting and strangely aquatic entity that we only see glimpses of as we begin splish-splashing our way through the level. I say invaded, but that's probably the wrong word. The level description says that the entity here has been abandoned to decay and rage, and because of this, I think it's worth returning to a theory from the last video. Whether or not Six is officially the lady's daughter, there's still a lot of evidence to her being next in some kind of line or hierarchy, which was meant to keep the maw running. As mentioned previously, there are pictures in the lady's house which imply she's not the only one of her kind, whatever that might be. Some theorized that Six consuming the lady was representative of her taking over the lady's role or position, and that's why she gains her power at the end. But what if the role has always been gained through force? Further playing reveals that the lady, beneath her mask, is similar in appearance to the beast that lurks in the depths, maybe because they're the same kind of beast. Who, quote-unquote, abandoned this character as the description reads? Well, it's possible that the former Lady of the Maw, after being defeated by the thing that would become the lady we know and love, was not killed, but instead imprisoned deep below the rest of the Maw and its inhabitants, locked away, a prisoner, becoming warped and aggressive by the solitude, hunger, and time. Kind of like mono. Violence is always a cycle. And so we get the Granny. Maybe there's another reason she's here, or maybe it's just another one of those instances of the nowhere being the nowhere and putting weird shit in weird places. Whatever the case, the runaway kid learns quickly that there's something in the water, and though he can't initially see exactly what it is, we can assume he's pretty on edge about it all, with the understanding that this place pretty accurately resembles the circumstances of his original nightmare, which doesn't bode well for the intentions of the Granny. We do some platforming and puzzle solving to get through this stage, lowering and raising water levels, tricking the Granny into going the opposite direction with food, and only swimming for brief periods when it is absolutely necessary. The Granny can swim very fast, and if she's near you when you hit the water, you're almost certainly a goner. There's a desperation to the Granny, one that becomes clearer as we see more of her revealed. She seems hungry and desperate. She consumes all the food we give her hungrily, and when we try to remove food from her grasp, she clutches onto it with monster truck force for as long as she can. During our attempts to escape the depths, we encounter more mysterious bags and packaging. There's a lot to imply that this place is connected in some way to the kitchen, due to bits of meat and packaging that appear here, some of which being clearly sent down from a higher location. One package we find, suspended high above the water, has a child's arm hanging limply from a tear in the side. It isn't news to us that there are probably a lot of dead kids around, but you might wonder in the back of your head if maybe you've discovered the fate of the flashlight girl. By the time you reach the end of this level, the Granny is pissed. She's fully revealed herself a number of times, and in your last moments with her, once she knows you're almost out and free, she tries collapsing the platform you're on with all her might so that you might fall into her grasp, but during her struggle, you can push a powered TV into the water and electrocute her ass. The Granny dies, and as you progress towards the next level, it might occur to you that the Granny was the first creature you ever encountered on the Maw that didn't seem to serve a specific purpose at all. She's not a customer, she doesn't prepare or move food. Once again, that idea of her being a prisoner lingers. Maybe you did her a service. Maybe she's free now. You don't have much time to linger on the morality of your actions, as quickly after ascending from the depths, you're captured by a familiar figure, and the scene ends. I really do love the way that Gnome Quest manages to thread itself into the main narrative of Little Nightmares. All things considered, the DLC is about as long and varied as the original game, and it actually took me much longer to play because I died a lot. The commitment the team behind the game showed goes above and beyond for the standards set by a lot of other major game studios' DLC practices. That moment in the original game where Six was trapped in a cage and watched a random other kid get dragged away, well, that kid was the kid. I should have planned better for that. We don't see what happens to the kid after he's dragged away, only that he ends up in a sack, being carried from one place to another via a conveyor belt. It's similar to the earlier bundle we saw the child's arm sticking out of, so I'm curious how we managed to avoid being killed during our ensackening, which is, I'm pretty sure, not a word. I'm also curious how we avoid being killed as we remove ourselves from the sack and fall violently into a stack of coal, smashing through a plank of wood on our way down. I guess the wood partially broke our fall. Sweet. We lay there like a Family Guy character for a bit until finally, the game lives up to the fake name I gave it, and we find ourselves surrounded by a bunch of gnomes. Now, our true gnome quest can begin. As you traverse through the next couple of rooms, you realize there are a ton of gnomes down here, like more than you ever encountered at once during Little Nightmares proper. In the original game, they're kind of comparable to rats, not in their actual qualities, but how we see them, scampering from one hidden place to another, usually in groups of only one or two, seemingly both out of their element and perfectly capable of surviving on their own. Down here, though, they are everywhere, and much more sociable. I think it's because the kid doesn't give off crazy dark protagonist energy like 6 does, and also that in the next couple of rooms, the kid proves himself much more warm and caring towards the gnomes, rescuing them from various levels of entrapment, some of which appear to be intentional, giving them nice hugs, and throwing them. They seem fine with it. As we gather a group of gnomish homies, or gnomies if you prefer, they begin to help us reach places we couldn't otherwise, move heavy objects together, and just generally provide one of the warmest atmospheres you'll encounter in any of the series. And I'm not saying that because of the furnace, but we should talk about that. There's a big furnace in this stage. It's kind of like the main thing here. That's why there's coal everywhere. It seems like this is where the maw gets its power from, and it seems like the gnomes are the ones responsible for fueling that power. We're not sure why the gnomes are so compelled to fuel the fire, but as you enter the main room, your posse breaks up and all the gnomes start gathering coal and putting it in the furnace. As they do this, a conveyor belt in the background that you could probably ride on moves a little bit, then stops. Clearly, it won't be fully operational unless you get more gnomes. I have to wonder, are the gnomes doing this because they actively want to help you, or is there another reason? Do they have a choice at all? With no way to answer the question, we focus our attention to gathering more workers to fuel the fire. There are a lot more gnomes hidden throughout this stage, and you have to do some real work to get them all back to the furnace, including walking through the pitch dark without— Oh, fuck! It's the janitor again! I honestly think this encounter with the janitor is much more intimidating. One, by how he's swallowed up by the dark, and if you're not looking right at him, you might lose track of him a bit, and two, by how much more unclear your path around him is. He's fumbling out in the open with a level of unpredictability that we didn't see when he was just working or chasing us in the original game. At this point, what he's even doing here is unclear. He might be looking for us, or he might just be hanging out. I think it's easy to assume every action these enemies take are always predatory, but hell, he might be on a break. Either way, getting caught by him is still not optimal, so you gotta juke him out just like always. Eventually, your gnome quest does, unfortunately, come to an end, as you finally gather enough workers that you're able to be carried up and out of the main area to a smaller furnace area, where a number of other gnomes are gathered in front of a smaller furnace. There's something wrong with the shadows they cast as they warm themselves by the fire. They almost look like kids. Huh. Well, no time to ponder on that. We got places to be, like on the top of this elevator where— Oh, shit. Oh, shit. By the way, the achievement you get when this scene ends is called End in Sight, and its description reads, "The final stretch will be largely uneventful," which is really funny because no the fuck it won't. The rest of our playthrough takes place in the residence of the Lady, a character that I luckily don't have to reintroduce you to, because if you've watched this far into this video without watching the first two, that's on you at this point. When we played as 6, we only got a little glimpse of the lady's quarters, a few rooms tucked out of the way, but as the runaway kid, we get to see what I assume is the majority of the rest of this place. It almost seems like a house, but here on the Maw, there are books everywhere, also paintings and sculptures, many of which resemble the lady. There is, once again, an air of elegance here and attached to her that really doesn't appear anywhere else in the game. Before you get to the main area of the DLC, you have to sneak past the lady, the kid hiding in the shadows of the room, and once again, she's standing in front of a broken mirror, a mask clearly on her face. Whoa, this place is huge. The majority of your time in this level will be solving various puzzles to get access to little sculptures that fit into another, larger puzzle you need to solve to progress. The puzzles themselves, while fun, aren't really that important. What is important are a lot of the decorations hanging in this place and the story they tell. For instance, these weird little symbols that are carved into the bottoms of these bookshelves. I've looked at a bunch of different theories for what these symbols represent. The wiki says that 2 of them represent the Maw and the Signal Tower, but that the other 2 have not been revealed. But other people think they might represent characters like the Pretender from Very Little Nightmares, scrapped concepts from Little Nightmares 2 like a TVI monster thing, or even characters from a scrapped physical Little Nightmares comic series that I guess I should talk about really quickly. So, a little while after the first game came out and got popular, a 4-part comic book series for the game was planned, and the first 2 actually got made before the project was cancelled and is now assumed to be non-canon. The reason I don't like bringing it up is because there are historical elements and choices made in the series that directly contradict information we later learn about the world in things like Very Little Nightmares and Little Nightmares 2. For instance, 6 is depicted in a place very similar to the Pale City, except it's filled with inhabitants that much more closely resembled those who come to the Maw, which clearly isn't the case for the city in canon. It also establishes a deeper connection between 6 and certain existing characters, like our favorite character, the bread-giving boy, who is depicted speaking to 6, which I just don't love. I think the way it was portrayed in game is better and more mysterious. The reason I'm bringing it up at all is because, while I don't think it's a valuable source of official lore, I'd be willing to bet that some of the concepts included within are still relevant to the Little Nightmares universe, and I'd even go so far as to bet that they'll be at least partially the focus of the upcoming third entry. The 3 primary concepts I want to mention are all different entities, 2 of which were only encountered by other children. Those 2 are called the Northwind and the Mirror Monster. The Northwind is a shrouded character that we barely are able to see, who apparently goes from town to town, destroying them in a ravenous mission to slaughter every child that he can find. As his name would imply, he carries with him a strong and powerful wind that destroys most things it touches. The Mirror Monster is also bad news for kids. He seems to only live in mirrors, and the special funky way that he kills kids is by luring them to his mirrors with visions of their wildest dreams, and then, when they're close enough, he reveals himself to be a tentacle-headed beast who grabs his victim with his hair tentacle things and brings them into the mirror. The Ferryman. He's this big, hulking figure with a dirty jacket and a strange, drooping face. As far as we know, he's the one who brings children to the Maw, which is obviously scary in what it represents, but the way the series treats him, the way he seems to remove himself from the standard that most inhabitants of this world comply with, how he almost seems calm. Though we haven't encountered this character physically in any game, the idea that he might be more relevant than the actual games are implying might start to appear in the back of our mind. But there's not much we can do with these ideas right now, so let's finish going through the DLC first. There are lots of minor secrets and theories attached to them in here, so I'm going to do a lightning round real quick. There are a number of life-size geisha statues throughout the residence of the lady, all of which mostly resembling the lady herself. However, one of them appears to be headless. Some theorize that this geisha represents the former lady of the Maw, and that the current one broke her head off because she couldn't stand looking at the form. Maybe this was the entity that would go on to become the granny? Speaking of headless statues, you can find 8 headless little girls scattered throughout the stage. These could represent any number of people, potentially the lady and siblings, or at least other potential ladies when they were younger. Former successors to the position of the lady? We don't know why their heads are all gone. There are a number of paintings that seem to represent characters from Little Nightmares 2, including the teacher, porcelain children, and there's even this hallway where you're surrounded by pictures of eyes, kind of like the interior of the signal tower. You can also find this insane painting if you go out of your way to solve a book puzzle, and truly, I have no idea what exactly it's supposed to represent. The achievement you get when you find it is called Ashes to Ashes, and there's an element of flame or burning to the design, so it probably has to represent one of those somehow. I think maybe it could have to do with the gnomes down powering the furnace. I don't think there's an answer for this, but maybe the painting is meant to represent their torment to some degree or another. I also found a theory saying that maybe the lady had children at some point, which she killed or burned. I don't know. You tell me what you think. Anyway, the final bits of exploring this place are very creepy. These little shadow puppet kids begin popping up all around you, first passively out of the corner of your eye, but then aggressively, attempting to dive bomb you and kill you for some reason. However, you've got a pretty good defense, and these little dudes are sensitive to light and will be fully destroyed if kept under your flashlight for a couple seconds. With their white masks and their aversion to being seen, they almost feel like little versions of the lady. Speaking of which, as we move forward and finally away from these guys, we see the lady down a hallway, looking at herself in the mirror, only this time she's maskless, and the mirror appears to be unbroken. Finally, we get a good look at her real... Ew. The lady does not like that we have seen her, and she makes that very clear, screaming at us and chasing us like a mad woman. However, this time we can't beat her, and obviously, 6 is the one who beats her, later in the timeline, I guess, and so now as we flee, I can't help but think, am I going to get out? No. Because eventually, the lady catches you, surprising you from the darkness and holding you in place, shadows flowing around you and through you, crushing you, condensing you, until finally, oh my god, we're a gnome. The gnomes are kids! See? That's why they cast those shadows, that's why they're so happy to help you. They're kids, probably ones who also got caught trying to escape. The lady wastes nothing, so it would seem. If you're not food, you're a worker, keeping the lanterns lit so your more passive brethren can be chopped up and served. No one escapes, no one except... No, I remember this room. No, I remember that sausage. No! I love this ending. It's so perfect for the series, I think, and it makes Six look even worse to us, taking her from being a gray protagonist and making her a full-on villain, at least in the context of us playing as the kid. By the way, there's that other theory about why Six eats us that I mentioned earlier, and I'll bring it up now. If you remember the ending of Little Nightmares 2, after Six is stolen away by the Thin Man, she leaves behind a shadowy version of herself, the same that we see in the secret ending of that game, leading her to the Maw. Whatever has been separated from Six has remained separated from her. Maybe it's her conscience or her morality, or just a section of her that is less definable, but whatever the case, Six continues throughout the rest of her story without it. Except that's not really true. Every time Six eats in the first game, we see the shadow. Usually it's hidden, or at least out of the way, but it's always there, watching passively as Six becomes hungrier and hungrier and acts more and more violently. Maybe the shadow is driving Six to this hunger. Maybe the fact that she's separated from it is what's driving her. Either way, though, there seems to be a duality here, represented by two physical pieces of Six appearing at once but separately. Interestingly, while we can pretty easily guess what they both represent in unity, that being duality, it's much harder to decide which piece of them represents what. If you broke your personality in half, would you know which part of you was which? And that's probably why Six drops Mono, because she's lost something. Maybe her memory, maybe her humanity, maybe her ability to empathize. We don't know, but something is missing. See, if you haven't picked up on this yet, pretty much every piece of Little Nightmares fiction really serves the grand purpose of illustrating that the only way to survive in the nowhere is to be a monster. Little Nightmares 2, as mentioned earlier in this series, is about survival versus heroics, and through Mono's eyes, proves to us that being a hero only gets you into more trouble. Very Little Nightmares teaches us that it's safer to be removed from the struggle of others, and only to help when it might benefit us. And of course, Little Nightmares proper tells us that the only way to beat the big guy is to become like him, to kill without remorse, and we learn that like 3 different times in that game. So what does Gnome Quest, or, to be serious for a moment, the Secrets of the Maw, teach us about the nowhere? Simple. There is no room for warmth here. Even the physical warmth of the fireplace represents something dark, the enslavement of these children, the cold that must exist so palpably everywhere else in this place that everyone feels the need to gather here near its blaze. The other kids you encounter are uninterested in your struggles. Helping the gnomes as the kid just gets you turned into one of them. Trying to feed a starving Six just gets you killed. In most of these situations, I wouldn't call the kid's actions heroics in the same way I would for Mono. Mono was being an action star, killing enemies and diving towards danger. The kid was just trying to be kind. You can see that in his hugs, in the way that the gnomes treat him versus Six, and in that final action he takes before he's eaten. The kid, in my opinion, is probably the most gentle character in the series, despite still killing enemies himself. It really can't be avoided here. And now, finally, shockingly, we've covered every single existing piece of canonical visual Little Nightmares media, and we finally understand the truth behind the nowhere, which is obviously, if you take it all in and really, well, see, because of the signal tower, and well, Six is really the most, God damn it, why am I still so confused by the nowhere? Why doesn't it make sense? Why don't I understand the rules? It still feels like a mystery, like a suggestion of something more important, like a goddamn bad dream about... Is it a dream? Before we finish this video, and by extension this series, at least for now, we have to talk about the final and most recent actual entry into the universe of Little Nightmares. But before we do, I actually have a personal note I'd like to make. I started playing Little Nightmares right at the beginning of high school, and that was a weird time for me. I was changing as a person, from a kid into the first concepts of an adult I would go on to become. And as I'm sure many of you can relate to, it was a painful transition. The people I'd grown up with were changing, just like me, and all became a bit more different and separate. I started going to a new school. I started dealing with a more serious version of depression and anxiety. I didn't know what I was going to do with myself in both the short term and the long term. It was hard, and yet not unique. Being a kid is really scary. And there was something about that first game and that little girl in the raincoat that I understood, even if I couldn't point it out at the time. That feeling of constantly needing to hide or run or become something scarier or harsher to save myself from the nightmares I was encountering on a regular basis. It was familiar in, of course, a surreal and warped kind of way, but those words described most of my reality, at the time at least. When Little Nightmares 2 came out, I was about to graduate. I had figured a lot of my shit out by then, but new shit has a way of popping up just when you feel you're in control. Either way, though, I was back. I was back in this world, dealing with these monsters, suddenly on a larger scale and in an environment that was more palpably adult. And was that what it was going to feel like when I finally graduated and left home? Would it be like entering the Pale City? Would I find myself in an endless cycle of effort and failure, all in pursuit of a goal I might never actually reach? Why am I playing games? Why am I acting? Why am I writing? Does any of this matter? Will any of it help me? And then I'm 19, and then 20, then 21. Not much of an adult in the grand scheme of things, but definitely not a kid anymore. I attend college for years. I decide to stop. I live on my own. I have relationships and breakups. I accrue debt and pay it off, then accrue more. My life doesn't become one cycle, it becomes made of many, all spinning around me in a constant rotation of chaos that I try to claim as routine, and despite, or maybe just because of that, I find a realer version of myself. I start writing again. I start writing a lot. I start being more critical of the things I love, and that leads me to more things I love. I start posting. The things I love start being worth something again. I start being successful, and then Little Nightmares 3 is announced. I play the first 2 games again. I remember being a kid. I think of being an adult now. I think how lucky I am to have made it. I think of how much I miss being a kid. I think of how much I hated being a kid. I think the same things about being an adult. I think about the nowhere. I think about the real world. I think I understand. I don't think it's possible to. I think it's all a dream. I think it's undeniably reality. I think I think too much. I think I want too much. I think we all do. I think Little Nightmares is about all of us. I think Little Nightmares is about humanity. I think that's why I love it. I think that's probably why all of you do too. And now, I think we should talk about the podcast. The Sounds of Nightmares is the most grounded Little Nightmares entry we get, whatever that means, and there's only 6 episodes. I'm not even going to point that one out. If you haven't noticed it, there's almost certainly no way you've been paying attention to the series. Happy to be your background noise, though. Hope your drawing or knitting or whatever is going well. The reason I call it the most grounded is because, as far as I can tell, the majority of it actually takes place in our universe, in the reality that you and I are sitting in right now. What is so fascinating about this reveal is that it proves that not only is the nowhere a separate and distinct place from reality, it also means that we should be considering our own reality as a part of the Little Nightmares canon, as another potential explanation for what's going on or where people are coming from. One question that's managed to evade the majority of this analysis is, where are the kids coming from? The presence of this ferryman character, who we know very little about going into the podcast, implies that they have to be being brought from somewhere else, but is it somewhere else in the nowhere, or is it somewhere out here? And if it is out here, referring to the real world, where is it? Can it be accessed by anyone? Can it be returned from? That's kind of the question that the entire podcast seems to be about. The series includes 2 main speaking characters, one of which being that counselor that I mentioned in the first video, the other of which being a character called Noon, spelled specifically the way it appears on screen, which is important because if you separate the name between the O's, it becomes No One, a name that potentially holds huge ramifications in the face of a location called the Nowhere. See, Noon has been placed under the psychiatric care of a counselor named Otto. And yes, I should clarify since I made a point of it in the first video, the counselor does have a real name and isn't just the counselor. However, we've already gone down a bit of a rabbit hole on duality, so the fact that he has both shouldn't be a game changer for us. In fact, it should help solidify this growing idea that there's a mixture of elements in us, a bit of good and bad. The only question is, which part is stronger? Throughout the course of the podcast, Otto is treating Noon for two separate things, one officially and the other privately. Officially, he's here to treat Noon, who appears to be having delusions of sickness, specifically claiming she has something called water sickness, which Otto strongly implies she does not. I'm inclined to believe Otto in this case, but not because he's particularly trustworthy. The other thing he's investigating has to do with nightmares. That should ring some bells for anyone who simply knows the name of the podcast or anything past that. Apparently, someone he cares about, someone called Cece, has gone missing, and her disappearance has something to do with dreams. Noon, in sessions with her counselor, will recount a number of dreams she has where she's dropped into strange and horrifying sections of a place that all appears to be one massive world, the nowhere. Every time Noon goes to sleep, she wakes up somewhere else in the nowhere. Now, the counselor seems familiar with elements of Noon's story, likely from this undisclosed connection to the character of Cece, who we understand to have been capable of a similar sort of dream walking through context clues and later confirmation. But we don't know any Cece. She's never described, never pictured in game, never even mentioned. But something interesting I've noticed about Noon's description of the world, of the things and people she encounters there, is that a lot of them seem to be kids, and most of them seem to have titles instead of names, like Jester or the child with the gooey hair. It's like whatever you were in the real world, which is where I imagine a number of these kids came from originally, goes away in the nowhere, and you're reduced to whatever you are, kind of like being referred to as only a janitor, or a chef, or a teacher. Simple titles, simple ideas, twisted. It really is like the nowhere is just one big nightmare. Throughout all of her explanations, Noon keeps mentioning this thing called the Candleman. He's this big, hulking figure with a dirty jacket and a strange, drooping face. He's the ferryman. Noon's been seeing the ferryman, and not only that, it seems like the ferryman has seen Noon, as well as Cece, but why? What is happening? Why is any of this relevant? Is it just meant to confuse us more? No. It's not. The point of this podcast is actually shockingly simple. It's to explain two things: how to get to the nowhere and where 6 came from. There's a scene in the podcast where Noon describes coming across a yellow raincoat among a pile of other clothes. Upon hearing this, the counselor reacts dramatically, questioning her frantically if anyone else was there, and though he doesn't say it out loud, anyone who's played the games should know why this raincoat is so important, why it's so iconic, why Otto is so terrified when he realizes it's there unattended. It was Cece's, which can only mean one of two things: that Cece is the character we played as in Very Little Nightmares, or that Cece is 6, her name stripped away just like everything else in this world. Obviously, at first it makes more sense for her to be from Very Little Nightmares, but don't forget, the nowhere is a world of dreams, and by extension, dream logic. Maybe, when 6 picked up the raincoat, it wasn't just because she was cold and in the rain, but because she recognized it from her real life, her original life with Otto. There is an invisible force moving through all these games, be it the signal tower or the lady or fate or something else, but what if that same force, that same spirit of mystery, led 6 back to the part of her personality she thought she had lost and would maybe even go on to lose again? Otto forces Noon to go further and further into these dramatic dreams with such fervor and intensity that we quickly grow to distrust and dislike Otto. He, like all the adults in the nowhere, is just using children as tools, an idea he vocalizes a distaste for by the beginning of the story, but falls into just the same by the end, putting Noon, a girl who has real connections and family in the real world, at incredible risk by forcing her into a confrontation with this Candleman or Ferryman or whatever you want to call him, and he loses her. The Sounds of Nightmares is really a story about two manipulators in a struggle to gain control over Noon. Otto, so he can find his sister, Cece, and the Candleman, so he can bring Noon permanently into his world. And the Candleman wins! He convinces Noon that her water sickness, a sickness I'm still not convinced ever existed in her, won't hurt her in the nowhere. And because Otto has failed so grandly at doing his actual job, which is taking care of a child, which is what every adult monster fails to do in this series, another child is lost to the horrific world of the nowhere. And Otto makes up his mind to try again. Violence is always a cycle. Adults are monsters. Kids have to fight to survive, and violence is always a cycle where adults are monsters and kids have to fight them to survive, and the violence becomes a cycle where these kids grow into adults who are monsters, and their victims are kids who have to fight to survive with a violence that is always a cycle. The entirety of the series of Little Nightmares holds a mirror up to humanity and says, Look at what you've done. Look at how you've scared your kids. Look at the world you've created and how it perpetuates itself and how it will continue to long after you're gone, and how the people you've hurt within it will only continue to hurt until that hurt spills out and the cycle continues. Little Nightmares takes place in a dream, but it's about reality. And maybe that's why Little Nightmares 3 seems to be about a mirror. It could be a reference to that mirror monster character we talked about earlier, just as the rest of the trailer could be showing the damage dealt by the north wind, but even if that is the case, a mirror always means something. It just does. Maybe we've reached a breaking point where it's no longer possible to hide from ourselves with masks or darkness. Maybe it's time to acknowledge the truth about ourselves. That we are all terrible. But we don't have to be.